Hello, good afternoon. Welcome to IAF's first foreign policy mashup. We have 144 registrants and we're at 74 participants. Welcoming everyone on this beautiful day. I'm Layla Halal, and today is the final regular program for our 26th season. And what a season it has been. We thank you for staying with us as we've weathered a pandemic and mass civil upheaval. We are thrilled to have Ambassador Charles Shapiro back with us today to help us unpack global policy trends and the future of US leadership in the world. Ambassador Shapiro is a Latin America Affairs expert, a former US ambassador to Venezuela, and coordinator on Cuban Affairs. We also have today with us an esteemed panelist for this first mashup. I will introduce the panelists after Ambassador Shapiro shares with us some of his insights. But just a couple housekeeping issues. We will be taking questions in this webinar. Please submit your questions via the chat function, which you'll find at the bottom toolbar. Please submit your questions as they come to you during the course of our discussions, and we'll try to get to them if time permits. And lastly, we recommend that you use gallery view for this webinar so that you can see the ambassador and all of our panelists together. So Ambassador, please share with us your thoughts.
Thanks, Layla, I appreciate it. Thank you. Thank you for inviting me back to Traverse City.
Yes.
I wish I could be there in person, but I'm delighted to be with y'all virtually. Layla invited me here, I believe, because of a talk I gave at the National Conference of the World Affairs Councils of America, the umbrella organization, back in November 2019. And it seems so long ago because we were in the middle of the impeachment hearings in the House of Representatives. At that conference, former Secretary of State James Baker and former Secretary of Defense Chuck Hagel had just spoken, and I was depressed. Depressed because the Republican Party they represented, internationalists, supportive of free and fair trade and open markets, an inclusive party without which the Civil Rights Act would never have passed, a party that developed expertise in foreign policy and brought in political appointees from the Hill and think tanks, the party of Gerald Ford, Ronald Reagan, and both Bushes. That party no longer exists. Back in November, I thought the problem was that the administration rejected expertise in foreign affairs and national security. Well, since then, we've all found out as COVID-19 spread across the country, that was just part of the problem. The administration rejects expertise across the board. It's an administration based on whim. People monitor their Twitter accounts, people within the administration monitor their Twitter accounts every morning to discover what our policy is. We found out just yesterday that our president doesn't know that Great Britain is a nuclear power or that Finland is an independent country, and that the president not only used the power of his office to get information to help his re-election from Ukraine, but he also was dealing with China to the same end. I saw this morning, going back to November, that the White House is holding up an entire United States Army promotion list, the list of promotions from lieutenant colonel to colonel, because Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Vindman is on the list. And we all remember who Lieutenant Colonel Vindman is, an immigrant from the Soviet Union, a man who embodies the American dream. Why does the president so dislike Lieutenant Colonel Vindman? It's because the man honored his oath of office. I've sworn that oath 3 times. In 1971, when I joined the United States Coast Guard as a seaman recruit. In 1977, when I joined the Foreign Service of the United States. And again in 2002, when Secretary Colin Powell swore me in as the United States Ambassador to Venezuela. That oath was the very first law passed by the United States Congress in 1789 after the Constitution was ratified. All of us who have ever held federal office, who've ever served in the military, have sworn to support and defend the Constitution of the United States and to bear true faith and allegiance to the same. I have never been prouder of my Foreign Service colleagues and of my civil service and uniformed military colleagues across the federal government. While we are denounced by the loyalists as the deep state, they are in fact the expert whose job it is to give the best advice to the president and his appointees, and then to carry out their decisions, so long as those instructions bear truth, faith, and allegiance to the Constitution. Most are not famous. They're not celebrities. They're not heroes. They're just doing their job. And that's why what you're doing in Traverse City and what we at the World Affairs Council of Atlanta are doing and what councils across the World Affairs Council network are doing is so important. We organize expert panels. Tonight in my case, it's an in-expert panel. We organize panels, conferences, seminars. We always bring in differing points of view. We educate our members, our students, our world questers, our boomers, and our Generation Z youngsters that public policy is complex. We teach everyone that policy is not a binary. It's not black and white with the right and wrong answer. That is the ethos of the World Affairs Councils of America. And it is more important now than ever as we find ourselves in what I believe is a historic point of inflection. And I'm proud of us, proud of the International Affairs Forum, proud of the World Affairs Council of Atlanta, proud of what we do, proud of what y'all are doing. It is an honor to be part of this network and to be with you this evening. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ambassador, for those inspiring words. Now, I'll bring in our panelists. Jack Segal, retired senior U.S. diplomatic advisor who served in Russia, Ukraine, Israel, and many other places. Mike Lehnert, Major General, U.S. Marine Corps, retired. Marguerite Cotto, NMC's VP for Professional and Lifelong Learning, and Jack Zachman, NMC Professor of Political Science. I will give Jack the pleasure of asking the first question to the ambassador.
Thank you very much, Leila, and thank you, Ambassador Shapiro. It's a great pleasure to see you here again. And I should add that my wife Karen and I had the pleasure of being on a tour of Cuba that was organized by Ambassador Shapiro. And if he ever can get to do that again, I encourage you to contact the Atlanta World Affairs Council because it was a great experience. You spoke about the drawing on the expertise of the people who are members of government, who have sworn the same oath that we have sworn. And I really felt like we're looking at two alternative possible universes after November. One is a continuation of an administration that really does not want to use the traditional systems of running the government. And so in the case you cited of Ukraine, you had the official policy, Bill Taylor and Masha Yovanovitch, and then you had the three amigos running their own alternative foreign policy. You have worked in Washington and I've been on the NSC, and There is a structure there, and it's still there, although it's not being utilized. In that other alternative universe, do you foresee us going back to using the NSC process, the policy-making procedures that we have used in the past, or have we made a complete turn away from that now?
First, let me describe what that process is a little bit. So it's the way that the National Security Council on Foreign Affairs, the National Economic Council on Economic Affairs, make sure that everybody's voice is heard. State Department may have one point of view, Treasury another, Defense Department a third on what our policy should be towards country X. And so the point of the National Security Council is to bring those together, to come up with a clear set of options for the president. And when I say clear, I mean really crystal clear. What are we going to do with each of these options, so that the president and his closest advisors can make a decision based on fact. So are we going to go back to that? I sure hope so. What we saw, I mean, I just was astounded. I want to say it was the first weekend after this administration was sworn in, when they issued the executive order on immigration. And I scratched my head. I said, well, how could they not do that proper, whether you support it or not? How can they not write it in a way that it'll stand up in court? That there are people at the National Security Council, there are people at, in this case, Justice Department, whose job it is to help the president, particularly a new president, write an executive order that will stand up in court. And they just ignored that. And that has been the story throughout the administration with every department and agency of the government, unfortunately. And so it's, in soccer terms, it's own goal after own goal after own goal.
Let's do that. If I could just follow that, I've served in the NSC under President Clinton, and there were 53 members of the NSC staff. By the time of the end of the Obama administration, there were 330 NSC staffers. The temptation was to pull more and more authority into the NSC. Now, there's an article by Bob Gates in the current Foreign Affairs magazine where he talks about the need to revitalize the State Department and the NSC, but primarily to make the State Department the focal point for all policy relating, all foreign policy issues. Really the question becomes, in this day and age, with communications being much more sophisticated than they were in 1947 when the NSC was created, is it necessary now, or have we gone to a new phase and we need to have a new structure in Washington?
That's for the president to decide. That's for the president's chief of staff to decide. I mean, what works well for Obama may not be what worked well for Bush. And so it's got to be what works for them, not a cookie cutter that works for all. And I'm sure you saw that when you were in the National Security Council. And that's what we ought to be talking about. How many people do you want in the National Security Council? What should they be doing? What should the departments be doing? And as you said, technology has made it so easy for people to get in touch with their counterparts in foreign governments, or their counterpart at Defense Department, that you don't need to go through a formal process. The advantage of the process is everybody's heard. Everybody's heard. So is that process bigger or smaller, or more people, fewer people? I mean, that's what each administration needs to decide for itself.
Mike?
Yes, Ambassador, it's good to see you again. I'm going to explore the issue of dissent. You talked about it a bit in your opening remarks, but I think it's worthy of some additional comments. An unprecedented number of retired flag officers and diplomats have spoken out regarding the administration policies, the most recent being former Secretary Mattis. Now, while on active duty, generals and ambassadors are expected to carry out the policy decisions of America's elected leaders. But what happens if those decisions would appear to violate treaties, laws, and even the Constitution? And I'd like you to comment, if possible, on how both our active and retired senior government officials should conduct themselves during these times. The side who support the administration question whether dissent is permitted. And based on our oath of office, which you mentioned in your opening remarks, is it required?
Ooh, well, that's a great question. Look, one of the things that's important for all of us in the executive branch to remember is there's only one person in the executive branch who's been elected by the citizens of the United States, and that's the president. In Canada, all the cabinet secretaries are members of parliament, right? So they've got their own independent power base. But in our government, it's only the president. Our job, your job, is to present the best advice you possibly can to your superior and then carry out those instructions so long as they are legal. The option, of course, if they're illegal, is to resign. And that's something people wrestle with every day when you reach a certain level in government. I mean, if I disagree with the policy in the Balkans, if I think people are being killed, human rights abuses are being committed, as happened in the Clinton administration, a fair number of people resigned because of that, because they thought it was so wrong. That's something each individual has to resign, has to make up their own mind about. I mean, it's your career. It's something you've devoted yourself to. Obviously, in your case, you care about the United States Marine Corps. You have taken on the ethos of the Marine Corps. You've got a family support, so you don't resign easily and readily. It's a tough decision to make. And you tell me, in your career, if you ever had decisions where you had to sit there and think, wow, I'm not sure this is the right thing to do.
Yeah, well, Ambassador, that actually did happen to me. I was a young brigadier general running the Guantanamo, and I was told to use enhanced interrogation techniques. And I had to tell the Secretary of Defense that I wasn't going to do that, which is not something junior brigadier generals are supposed to do. I think the difference and the distinction in that particular administration is they simply found somebody else who would do it. It did not affect my career. Today, you mentioned Lieutenant Colonel Vindeman, it's a different circumstance.
Yeah. Listen, somebody was telling an anecdote about General Mattis when he was the commander of CENTCOM, and that he'd gotten a call to make a decision about whether or not to go ahead with bombing targets. And in this case, I believe it was in Syria, ISIS targets. And, they wake him up in the middle of the night, ask him the question. Turns out that the target wasn't what they thought it was. So there's an investigation afterwards. And at the investigation, I asked him, well, how long did it take you to make that decision? And his answer was 40 years. Because it was based on his 40 years of experience in the Marine Corps to make that decision. I mean, the easy decisions are made by the lieutenants. The easy decisions are made by the junior foreign service officers. When you're the brigadier general, when you're the ambassador, the only decisions you get to make are the hard ones.
I'll just close by, and I agree entirely with you, Ambassador. The oath of office that you took and I took and the president takes is to the Constitution, as opposed to those who are enlisted. They take an oath to the chain of command, which includes the President of the United States. That does not apply for commissioned officers or ambassadors.
If I can just add something here, I can't let it go. Since I'm in Atlanta and you're not, that's why those Confederate statues need to come down. I mean, those generals took that same oath of office that you and I took, and they broke their oath to the Constitution of the United States of America.
They did.
Marguerite?
I'd like to borrow Jack's language of alternative scenarios that are out there. You have distinctive experiences in your service in two countries that are not very well understood in the United States, in a continent that is not very well understood by American citizens or its formal international policies in the hemisphere. So having grown up and been educated in the Caribbean, in Puerto Rico, it has always been interesting to me the passionate acknowledgement of Latin Americans of the great instruments of policy and organization of the United States, our Constitution, our Bill of Rights. So in the alternative environment that I imagine, we as citizens are curious and interested in Latin America and its nuances, its differentiation. How do you see citizen engagement helping to strengthen policy, its practice, the recruitment of new generations to practice in the art of policy? Your thoughts on that would be so welcome.
Well, first, I'm going to guess that your local newspaper doesn't carry a lot of international news. My local paper does not either. And in fact, if you look at the front page of the New York Times and the Washington Post, more often than not, there's no international news on the front page there either. So you have to really work at it. And we're blessed by living in a country that is a continental-sized country, where maybe not in northern Michigan, but certainly in Georgia, you can live your whole life and have a rewarding life and never leave the United States. That's why the World Affairs Council Network is so important. It's important to not just students at NMC and at the university that I teach at, but it's not just for students, it's for all of us, lifelong learning about the world. Okay, that's a long introduction to say our knowledge about Latin America is abysmal. Just abysmal. And, everybody's got their anecdote. Everybody's ever served in Latin America, has ever lived in Latin America, has got anecdotes about how little Americans know and understand about Latin America. And I can tell you humorous anecdotes longer than Layla will want me to. But the two things. Number one is the diversity of Latin America. And we think Latin America is one thing, that all of Latin America is like Mexico, right? Which just could not be farther from the truth. So that's part of it. But the other thing is there's huge citizen engagement, not just with Latin America, but with Europe and with the Middle East and with the Far East. One of the gentlemen who's just joined our board of directors at the World Affairs Council here in Atlanta, he said the key moment in his life was when he was a foreign exchange student in Japan as a university undergrad, that it just changed his world view. Right? By the way, he works for a Japanese company now. He's the highest ranking American in a Japanese company. I'm sorry, highest ranking foreigner in a Japanese company. And so when you travel, whether it's in the Middle East or it's in Africa or it's certainly in Latin America, which is so close and so easy to get to with so many flights from so many places, I mean, there are people there that U.S. embassies have no idea are there, from organizations, from Rotary clubs, from churches, from universities, softball teams, baseball teams, just all across Latin America. And you see the same thing in Africa, and you see the same thing in Asia. And that's the soft power. I mean, that's the informal contact between our country and the other country, which in many ways is way more important and way more powerful than what you can do when you're sitting in the front office of an embassy and you don't have enough resources to do the sorts of things you want to do. Well, in the slum area of the city you're posted in, there's a whole bunch of people out there from a church in Arkansas you've never heard of, who are meeting with the people from their counterpart church in that country.
And it did not escape my ear in a trip that a NMC team did to China several years ago, discovering that one of the growing languages in China is Spanish, as they look at the expansion of their influence in Latin America. And so that confluence of the political view, the global view, the social view is going to be quite interesting in the years to come.
Well, most of the countries in Latin America, with the exception of Mexico and maybe Colombia, among the major countries, their number one trading partner is China. Used to be the United States. It was the United States for 60, 70 years. Now their number one trading partner is China. Chinese companies are evident all over Latin America. Chinese embassies have the money to give to do this, that, and the other. And so, yeah, there's great and growing influence of China in Latin America, in Africa, in Pakistan, in the Middle East. And, you know, we are, I mean, I'm not sure we should. I'm not sure how, but it's something we ought to be talking about. I mean, how, you know, are we going to match every soccer stadium that the Chinese give away? I don't think so. That's not what the United States does, right? Yeah.
Thank you.
So, yeah.
I'd like to jump in with kind of a broad question, and I guess I'll frame it returning back to the notion of bureaucratic expertise. And I think there's a certain paradox, and that's that our bureaucratic expertise in the United States, you could argue, won us the Cold War. At the end of the day, bureaucracies in a capitalist system, in a democratic system like the United States, proved to be far superior than was the case in the Soviet Union. So the Soviet Union collapses and the Cold War ends, and in the 1990s, we become the world's hegemon, you can argue. But paradoxically, what we lost there was a narrative that was inspiring. So in other words, in the 1990s, we are the world's single superpower. But unlike in the Cold War, we're not really sure what we're all about, or at least we're beginning to fade in terms of what we actually want to do. And I want to suggest that the Trump administration is kind of the culmination of that. It's that we don't have a notion of what we want to do, what we want to achieve, what actions we should take, because we don't really have any goal for our actions. And in the so the current political climate is one of essentially destruction. It's to say we want freedom, but we don't know what freedom is, and so we're going to destroy. And so Trump is fundamentally a destroyer, just in terms of it's a negativity, right? It's always in reaction to something. This needs to be torn down because it limits freedom. We don't know what freedom is, but it's the opposite of that. And I want to also suggest that on the left, you also have this negative conception of what freedom is, without anything positive to replace it. And so what I'm getting at with this is that I totally agree that the Republican Party has reached a point where the old Republican Party that I grew up with no longer exists, and it is, of course, at a moment of redefinition for itself. But I also want to suggest that the Democratic Party is in a similar position. And then paradoxically, of course, we have Joe Biden as their presumptive nominee, who in many ways represents bureaucratic expertise. I mean, I think the thing Joe Biden has going for him is he has a lot of experience in government. He'll be a rational decision maker and will listen to bureaucrats. But it seems like we're at actually a wonderful and also a terrifying moment. And the moment is that this is the challenge of for us as a democracy to define, what do we want to do? What do we want to do internationally? What do we want to do domestically? And that the old guard, embodied in somebody like Joe Biden, ultimately is not going to answer that for us. So no matter who wins the election in November, that's going to remain unanswered. And then the worry I have is that, traditionally we might say, well, this is then the task of the young. It's ultimately probably not the task of us here on this Zoom panel. It's probably the task of the young. Then that raises the question of, what's this going to look like? So to get now to an actual question, it would be, what kind of goals do you see for American foreign policy and also for domestic foreign policy that can give us inspiration, that could get us back to a point where we can use bureaucratic expertise in the ways that we should, yet could bring the American people together who are so divided, so polarized, to move us forward in terms of an effective foreign policy. So that's, you could read my question as somewhat optimistic, because it's to say we're at a turning point where this is the year that we start to move forward into something new and promising, or it's also a terrible moment, because this is when we found out that we couldn't provide ourselves with goals, and it's, this is the entry into a very dark period for the United States. So with that long question, I'll hand it back to you.
Well, thanks, John. I appreciate it. Just one point that I would add is that the part of the bureaucracy in the United States is not just the career bureaucracy, is that both parties have experts in national security policy, in housing, in social policy, who, when their party's in power, they work in the administration and political appointee jobs. When their party's out of power, they go to think tanks or go to universities and teach, right? The think tank, depending on, some think tanks are more left-leaning and some are more right-leaning, and then they come back. And so I'm sure Jack has had this experience as well, is that through the course of my career, I've dealt with a lot of the same Republican and Democratic political appointees as they've come back in, and I know them from the last time they served in government. And of course, when they come back at a higher level, right? And that's what this administration, among other things, has not done. So that the people who had worked in the Bush administration are not in this administration, right? They weren't invited back. The people who know about trade, the people who know about national security policy, the people who know about monetary policy and treasury. I mean, those people are not back. And I think that is to the detriment of the Republican Party, that their own people with expertise aren't back in working as political appointees in the various departments and agencies. The second, the nuttier question is, how do we regain that? I mean, it's a heck of a lot easier when you're in a bipolar world and you've got an enemy. It's us in the Soviet Union, and my mom's next door neighbor can't understand that, right? You don't need to have a degree from Georgetown to understand these are the bad guys and we're the good guys. And I would argue that that's the beauty of our political system, is that, I mean, a successful politician doesn't just talk about policy and, wonkiness. A successful politician presents not just prose, but poetry. And it's the poetry that gets the votes, not the prose. And I'd argue that in the last election, Donald Trump did that better than his opponent. Mm-hmm. And for an issue that I care about enormously, the NAFTA, North American Free Trade Agreement, right? Do you remember it was the dumbest, worst agreement that the world has ever made, right? And so then President Trump's people renegotiate the agreement. In fact, it's a few changes that are not fundamental, but it's more makeup, right? And suddenly it becomes the most brilliant agreement the world has ever negotiated, correct? You've got to remember that 4 years ago, both parties ran against NAFTA. Both parties ran against NAFTA. Donald Trump actually created support for trade, for this trade agreement, now called USMCA here, and CUSMA in Canada, and I can't remember what it's called in Mexico, but Mexico is first, not the United States, obviously. And I take my hat off to Donald Trump for being able to do that, for getting trade onto the front page of your local newspaper where it had never been before. And that's what hopefully a Democratic candidate will be able to do, is to present that, to give that poetry, that to inspire people, to unite us as a country. And, and then the voters get to decide, do we want this vision for the country? Do we want that vision for the country?
It's interesting, just to follow up a little bit. I mean, in a way, you could just think of the difference between the current administration and previous administrations, in that the big difference would be that previously everyone kind of knew their role. If you were the communicator, the Reagan administration is a great one, because Reagan was an inspiring leader. He also knew what his role was. He put together a fairly traditional Republican team to administer the federal government, and he knew what his position was. And the current administration, that's where the disconnect is. The disconnect is in thinking that in fact this will and charisma and inspiration is the whole story. And so I just offer that as kind of a way to maybe think about the current administration being a departure.
Mm-hmm.
So just to remind people to submit your questions through the chat box, you can submit them to all panelists and attendees. So so everyone can benefit from your question, or you can direct your questions to one of the panelists. Now this is the mashup, so all of our distinguished and esteemed panelists have asked questions, but would any of you like to disagree with the other, or enter a dissenting view, or emphasize something? Please. The floor is yours before we go to questions.
Well, let me just go ahead.
Negotiate, Leila.
So maybe we'll go in order. I think we'll let Marguerite go first, and then to Jack. Okay.
My comment is really, John, I really liked what you said relative to this question of freedom, being free and knowing what to do with that, this idea of that. I go back to this duality of curiosity. As teachers, we talk about the need to develop, foster, encourage curiosity in learners. And the tragedy of a student is one who has very little about the subject matter that they're in, and they can't find their way there. I'm looking at this dilemma of curiosity, freedoms that technology and our process allow, but that are driven by anger more than curiosity. So going back to your remarks, which really connect with some of my thinking over the last few months, and the ambassador's comments on the power of experience and knowledgeable experience in a system coming head to head with next generations in there, how interesting it can be in a more positive way to be very thoughtful as to how we channel and push that and provide opportunities such as this to explore what it sounds like to be curious and to be angry, and to process all of that into a position that could lead toward leadership and all the other great things that we aspire to. But I liked your comment very much, and it gave the ambassador a very interesting place to comment on some of the history of what has gone very well for us as a country. So thanks for that.
Well, thank you for your kind words. And you know, the great concern I have is that it seems like we're at a point in our history where the American people have been fundamentally disempowered. You know, if the question is, what do we want to do? I feel like that's a question where the American people immediately reject it for them, that they don't ask that question, that there's anger and there's resentment, and there's also just a lack of agency. And that worries me greatly, because a democracy requires that the people believe that in fact we can do something. And I think that fits nicely with curiosity, because curiosity has the exact same thing. Curiosity, you believe that there's something to learn. If there's nothing to learn, no one's curious. It's a wonderful moment.
Can I disagree? I think what's going on right now, Black Lives Matter, is the most extraordinary thing, where young people have taken agency, where there's who's the leader of Black Lives Matter? There is none. Right. You know, who's out there organizing the demonstrations across Michigan, across Georgia, across the United States? Nobody. I mean, I think that is just phenomenal. And I'm so proud of these people. And I teach an executive MBA class. My students are in their 40s. You know, we did a really interesting conversation with the class that just graduated in March a couple of nights ago. And it's like, they're too old. They're in their 40s and they're too old. It's their younger brothers and sisters who are driving this, who have taken the agency, who've decided they're not going to put up with this anymore. Someone asked earlier about technology. I mean, that technology is that every single one of us has a cell phone in our pocket, and there's videos of everything that's going on in the world right now, right? And so when years ago, a policeman abused a citizen, who knew, except for the people right around that. Now we all know that. We all watched that 8 minutes and 46 seconds. And my kids, who were in their 20s, have decided, no, we're not putting up with this anymore. I mean, they're out there demonstrating.
I think that's a great comment. And the optimism that we have, I think, looking at that and the protests, that, the big question then is to say, thinking back to the Occupy movement of several years ago to now with the Black Lives Matter movement, it seems like the Black Lives Matter movement has a fundamental staying power that we're seeing in a way where the Occupy movement may not have. And I think it also, I would agree with you that it has a fundamental vision there of justice that is, I think that may have a staying power. So your optimism is much appreciated.
And the demonstrations after Rodney King and after, I'm sorry, I can't remember his name, in Baltimore and in Eric Garner in New York and in St. Louis, the demonstrators were almost all white, right? Mm-hmm. And now, I'm trying that again, we're almost all black, I apologize. And now white kids are out there. And not just a few, but a lot of them are out there. I mean, this has become an issue for everybody. And I think that's just huge and tremendous. And I'm so proud of those people who are out there.
And you speak from Atlanta, where there have been very large protests and where you've seen that diversity.
Going right by my house. I live downtown. So yeah, it's extraordinary. And to see the mayor of Atlanta and the chief of police resign and the mayor of Atlanta talking about what are we going to do? And the mayor of Atlanta saying, I'm the mayor. I can't protect my 18-year-old son when he goes out.
But in Traverse City, we have fewer people in the streets. And just to add a question to the mix of this discussion, we have had a question from one of the attendees saying, if you're a thoughtful, knowledgeable person that wants to influence the world, how do you get the president and his cabinet and his people to listen? If we aren't able to take to the streets here, what else can we do? That's a question raised and one to reflect on. Jack, I cut you off, so why don't you jump in and.
Let me take a stab at a couple of these issues, though. I can admire Black Lives Matter demonstrations, and I'm looking at them and I'm asking myself, how will they translate that power of being on the street, having a large number of people agreeing with them? How will they translate that into action? So, okay, we have now a theme that's been attached to Black Lives Matter, which was defund the police. And already the counter arguments are coming across from all directions. Now, I say all directions because I watch PBS and a little bit of Fox, and the problem is that none of the kids that are on the street watch any of that stuff. They get all their news from Twitter and Instagram and things like that. And so what that's good is they are able to talk to each other worldwide. So we have global demonstrations about Black Lives Matter, but they're just demonstrations. They don't do anything to change fundamentally what's going on. And that's my concern, that we now have begun to unleash the power of the next generation. And yet they don't see any link between what they are able to do now and what could actually change the structure of our society. And I think they're going to want to do that. And I think they're going to run into very powerful obstacles in trying to do that. So, it's really beyond the Democrat-Republican dichotomy here. It's neither party, particularly since both candidates for president are over 70 years old. Come on. Neither party is in any way relevant to a 20-year-old who's out there on the street. And I think that's a very tenuous position in terms of governing.
Jack, we're losing you, so we'll mute you. And Ambassador, did you want to come in and respond to that? You're on mute too. You're on mute, yeah.
I apologize.
No worries.
Well, there are all those jokes about old people not knowing how to unmute their Zoom, and I guess I'm one of them. It is to answer the question that you read earlier. You know, the traditional way to have an influence on a president is to make a donation, right? To not a small donation, but a huge donation, to be the bundler, right? To get for both parties. I'm not singling out one party over the other. And I hope that is going to change. I hope that has got to change, and that the way that, I mean, I will defer to the professors, but if I remember back, it's been a couple of years since I took that basic political science course, but that's the role of parties, is to aggregate the views of people and convert them into policy proposals. And hopefully our parties, Jack, are going to be smart enough to run after these kids and figure out what it is they're up to and take all of that and turn it into, does that mean defund the police? Does it mean reboot the police? Does that abolish the police? You know, what are, and I think it's quite interesting that you got a set of proposals from the Republicans who weren't planning on turning out a set of proposals, set of proposals in the House from the Democrats, which I don't think that was what Nancy Pelosi was planning on working on during this session, right? You got the president coming out. I mean, we're talking about that now, and I hope what we have seen, what all of us old guys here on this gallery have seen, is that justice on the street by the police is not equal for all. And we all know that's wrong. Now the question is, so how do you fix that? And I think we're going to have a discussion about that. And there are 18,000 police forces in the United States, 18,000. We're going to see all kinds of things. We're going to see failures in some places and successes in other places, and I think we're going to figure it out. But the idea that my Black friends are afraid of the police in a way that I can never understand, that has not happened to me. I know, and you know that is just flat out wrong, right? That has got to change. How do you change it? That's going to be more complicated.
Mike, do you want to come in and?
Yeah, I do. I tend to be a little more optimistic in terms of the way ahead, provided that these young people that are in the streets and on Twitter and everything else, and I think that the ambassador talked a little bit about the changes we've seen, the responses we've seen, both from both parties and the executive branch, and whether or not they're substantive yet. I think the concern on the part of our elected leaders is that these folks are going to move from the streets to the ballot box in November. And if they do that, they will make significant changes, and they will elect those individuals who they feel are likely to put those changes into effect.
So I'm going to move to some of the questions, and one of them is timely to what Mike just mentioned, which is that are we potentially going to see a third crisis emerge in and around the elections in November? Is it possible that President Trump may mobilize the military to disrupt or distract from the elections? If so, or if any sort of crisis emerges around the November elections, who in his administration would be the contrary voice or stop? General Mattis is no longer there. What might we expect from the executive office or the different branches of government if there is crisis? Any thoughts, amateur or professional?
Well, as I'm not the only one that's worn a uniform here, but I just wore it longer than the rest of the folks. I would be extraordinarily surprised if the senior military leadership in this country would support an unconstitutional or illegal action to retain power, if that's what you're implying, Leila. You know, both the ambassador and I spent a lot of time in countries where those things happen on a fairly regular basis, but I am inclined that there are institutions in place and the culture within our military that would preclude such a thing from happening. I hope I'm right.
Jack?
I would just add a comment that I think it need not go to the military. If we look back to the election of George W. Bush, the decision was made not to prolong the battle in the courts over the voting in Florida. Now, the current president has made it already, he has set up an argument that voting by mail is inherently subject to fraud. If there is an outcome that's close, which could easily happen, and a lot of the voting in the states that matter was by mail, he could fight in the courts for a very long time and say these votes have to be counted one by one, or they have to have a recount, or they have to have even a revote for the people who voted by mail. So you could then have a problem where the president is not yet been chosen. And this current president could say, well, since we don't have an outcome, I will continue in office until there is one. This would put an incredible amount of pressure on the country because there was a question earlier from one of the participants, what is Trump doing that might be right? What is he doing right? And I was writing down some things that I had thoughts of that, but from President Trump's position, he is doing what he thinks his base wants him to do. And number one is get reelected. And so if that means he has to tamper with the way we have normally conducted our elections, it won't be the first time. It's happened in American history. So we have to be prepared for that. I kind of less believe it would be calling on generals to bring their troops to Washington as it would be to have National Guard troops activated in particular states where they are under control of the governor. And that would be a very messy situation, which anybody who served in Latin America is probably quite familiar with.
Ambassador, do you have any perspectives from your time? And
look, a Chilean friend of mine was a Chilean investor, and he says, we all know that our militaries are loyal, three beats, until they're not. And that's the difference between Latin America and here. And that's why civil military relations in the United States are so important. And so that every time you've got a former general coming out and endorsing a candidate, it just makes, I find that very difficult. Obviously, retired generals got the same rights as every other citizen. But we've got to be real careful in this country about civil military relations. We have to be very careful in this country about civil military relations. Civil military relations, to have those political appointees at Defense Department, right? To have the generals who understand exactly what they do. They've spent their careers understanding that. And to have rallies where you have troops in the background behind the president, and you use those troops for political end. That is objectionable. should not happen, should not be allowed to happen. It should not happen again, no matter who. This is not the first president to try that, to do that. It should not happen.
You know, I'll offer just a brief comment, and that would be that this issue is probably not one that keeps me up at night of some issues that do. And I'd like to, I guess, maybe just thank James Madison on this one, because the federal nature of our elections gives us a lot of protection. And it's no accident that the executive branch does not certify the Electoral College vote, that in fact it is Congress that does that. And so I think there's that, and so that's one comment. And then the other comment might be that the protests that we have seen this spring in the wake of George Floyd and other atrocities, I think give everyone a healthy notion of what the streets might look like if you were to see something that's effectively a coup. So just those observations.
If I can add something here, it doesn't have anything to do with Latin America, but it has to do with having lived in California for 3 years, where I was an official mail-in voter. I mean, I did not go to, I mean, when I registered as a mail-in voter. And most people did. And what it meant was that if an election was close, you didn't know the outcome for weeks sometimes, because the people voting by machine, that's obvious. You know, you shut down the polls, you tally up the machines. But there really are people sitting in warehouses counting those mail-in votes one at a time. And so what Jack was saying is, as we move more and more to mail-in ballots, that really does delay the result. And we are, in this country, are so accustomed to, exit polls and, the network, I guess it's AP that officially calls the state for this candidate or the other candidate. And, we all want to stay up till 2 or 3 in the morning and go to bed knowing who the next president's going to be, or the congressman or the governor. And the more we go to mail-in ballots, the less that is going to happen.
Okay, we are almost at 6. I want to get in one question from one more question from the attendees, and that is for the ambassador. What are the implications of the decision to draw down the number of troops in Germany, for our alliance with Germany and our alliances more broadly? Some perspective on that.
Wow. Jack may know more about this than I do, but let me give you very quickly from my perspective is, first of all, this administration values bilateral diplomacy over multilateral diplomacy. Okay, and that's not invalid, but that's their preference. What we set up after World War II is a system of multilateral diplomacy that enhances our strength and our ability to influence events around the world. And probably preeminent among those institutions is NATO. And so we've had troops in Germany since the Second World War, and the number's gone up, it's gone down, it's at 35,000 now, if I'm not mistaken. We use those bases in Germany to support our involvement in the Middle East. The hospitals are there, the refueling is there, the troops move out of there. The president, and you saw this again if you read the synopsis of the book that came out yesterday, John Bolton's book, basically doesn't understand what NATO is about. He thinks that countries owe money to NATO, that there's a NATO bill that Germany is not paying. When of course that's not the case. There is no NATO bill. There's a commitment for each country to increase its own defense spending. So for the president to announce we're pulling 10,000 troops out of Germany, first of all, without telling Angela Merkel, the Chancellor of Germany, ahead of time, so she hears it in the press, is an insult to Germany. It's an insult to NATO. It restricts our ability to undertake actions, not in Germany, but in the Balkans or the Middle East or wherever it may be. And I would argue it undermines the United States' ability to respond. I mean, that it doesn't hurt Germany as much as it hurts the United States and our ability to project power around the world. And Mike's nodding, so he's right. And I'm going to defer to Mike.
Yeah, I just add, Ambassador, you've got it exactly right. What we're going to lose when we move those troops are logistics and medical capability to do the next thing. It's not in terms of its military capacity to stop something from happening. 9,000 troops are a speedboat, but in terms of those bases and the logistics capability, the medical facilities, you'd have to build that all over again during the next crisis. So you're exactly correct.
Okay. Well, thank you, everyone. We had 102 participants, attendees, and most have hung on. So thanks, everyone. Thank you, Ambassador Shapiro, for joining us and for all of the work you're doing in Atlanta, all your great programming. Thanks to all the panelists who brought in interesting and thoughtful perspectives. We are a vibrant community, as evidenced by this session. This is our last official event of the 26th season, but please look out for new and additional content now that we are utilizing virtual means. We will continue to seek ways to inform and engage. Please sign up for our newsletter at tciaf.com and keep informed of forthcoming programming, including for fall 2020, which admittedly is a little bit of a moving target. So we appreciate your patience as we try to figure out what's safe and feasible for us. And I want to thank everyone for renewing your membership or becoming a new membership. And thanks to our leadership circle for your donations. You're the backbone of IAF. So thank you, everyone. Have a good evening and goodbye.